This is the Westfield Quilters Guild Quilt Along Club, and this short video is going to help us understand some fabric basics as well as the need for pressing and sizing, or the way that you prepare your fabrics before you sew. So just a couple pieces of information related to fabric basics. And the first is, whenever you take a look at a piece of fabric, there's different terms that are used. And one is whenever you talk about the width of the fabric, and this is between the selvage. So this is from one side of the fabric to the other side of the fabric. When it comes off the bolt, that's what's called the weft or the woof of the fabric. These are the threads that are woven between the selvage. So they go from side to side, and then the length of the fabric, that is called the warp. And the warp is actually what is on the loom that is actually weaving the fabric. So these threads are in tension all the time that the fabric is being woven, whereas the threads that are going sideways, back and forth, that's called the weft, and they are being woven back and forth between the warp threads, which are in tension in the loom. So whenever you take a look at fabrics, and you take a look at how they're set up. These are pieces of fabric that have been cut in different ways, and when you go across the fabric this way, in these particular cases, this is the weft, so this is the width of the fabric. This came off of the bolt this way, and this is the warp of the fabric. So this was the direction that the fabric was on the loom. Now, the reason that makes a difference is the threads in a piece of fabric that are the strongest and the most stable are the ones that are on the warp. They're the ones that actually were on the loom. The ones that are on the weft are next least stable because they were being woven between the warp threads. The other term to be familiar with is what is a bias. And when you take a piece of fabric where you have the warp and the weft, and you cut it on an angle, like this piece of fabric, this is what's called a bias. Whenever you're cutting between the warp and the weft. And this is the least stable of all of the different types of cuts that you can have on a piece of fabric. So as an example, if we were to take this piece of fabric, and I'll pin the corner of it here, and I pull on it until it starts to misshape it, you'll notice that this piece of fabric now is actually misshapen. It is no longer a straight edge. It's been misshapen because I have started to pull the threads out of alignment with one another. And that is where, when you have a piece of fabric and you're actually sewing on, as an example, a biased edge, where both pieces of fabric have a biased edge, you need to be very careful not to stretch the fabric. You just need to be very gentle with the fabric and not allow it to be pulled or tugged one way or the other, because that can misshapen the fabric. The other thing that I wanted to help folks take a look at and be able to understand is whatever technique that you use to prepare your fabrics, You should use that technique consistently across your project. Don't prepare certain fabrics a certain way and another fabric a different way. So what I've done here is I've created 4 different samples of fabrics that were prepared different ways. This first one is this fabric was not washed and it was ironed only. So this fabric has never seen moisture at all. And all of these fabrics were originally cut as 3.5-inch squares. So this fabric had a weft and a warp of 3.5 inches. So this is a 3.5-inch square. It's perfectly sized. Everything is as it should be in terms of the size and geometry of this square. If we go to the next one, this one we actually sized with a spray sizing, which is similar to a starch, but we sized it and then we ironed it. And the ironing process dried out the fabric. And what's interesting, though, is this piece, which was as it was originally cut at a 3.5 by a 3.5, is now a 3 15/32 and a 3 17/32. What happened was the piece that was sized and ironed became 1% smaller in weft, and it became 1% bigger in warp. And you're probably asking, how can that happen? But that's what moisture does to fabric. It changes the size. It alters the composition of the threads in the fabric. So in this case, this sizing and ironing process made the fabric 1% narrower and 1% longer. So it made a difference there. The next example I did was whenever the fabric was wet and then it was ironed dry. So what I did here is I wet the fabric and I simply ironed it until it was dry. What happened here is that the fabric ended up becoming 3% narrower and 1% longer. And it has to do with how much the threads were being shrunk in width, and they actually extended or expanded in length. So you can see that if you were to cut your pieces first and they ended up getting wet, your pieces will not be the accurate size that you think they are. And the biggest culprit is actually the last one here. And this last one, this 3.5-inch piece of fabric was actually washed, dried in the dryer, and then ironed. And this piece started out at 3.5 by 3.5, and it became a 3 3/8 by a 3.5-inch piece of fabric. So what happened with this one is the weft, or the width of the fabric, became 3.6% narrower, but the length remained absolutely the same. So what is interesting to see is there's really no proper recommendation in terms of which one to do. The point here is you need to do it consistently across all of your fabrics. If you prepare one fabric one way and you prepare another fabric a different way, what you thought was a specific size will end up being different. So it's an important thing just to take the approach that you want to take and do it consistently across your project. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which many folks may not be aware of, is the impact of sizing on fabric. And I'll show you a sample here. This is a fabric. These are two 3.5-inch squares. The one on the left was ironed only. The one on the right was sized with a sizing, and then it was ironed. So what sizing does is it gives the fabric a little bit extra body. And what that means is it makes it a little bit stiffer and it makes it a little more rigid. And what that does is it essentially stabilizes the fabric so that as the fabric is handled, it actually it's a more stable piece of fabric. And the thing that I wanted to show you here is, once again, the ironed only is in the foreground, is the front fabric. The one that's sized is in the back. And you'll notice how the front fabric actually bends more than the fabric in the back. And that is that the fabric in the back is a little bit stiffer. And it's what it does for you in quilting is it just makes your pieces of fabric a little easier to work with, and they will be more manageable as you take a look at and work with your squares. So, as I said, and I wanted to mention this in the quilt along, the Barnstar Sampler Quilt. The author Kelly Kavanagh, she actually recommends doing the starching of fabrics that method. And she actually does the using of sizing, and that's what I use as well. Sizing is just a less stiff form of starch, and that is this process here whenever a fabric is sized, and this over here when a fabric is sized. So I hope that was helpful, just to give an overview of the construction of fabric, as well as the impact of how we prepare fabrics. And specifically for any project that you do, just simply do the technique that you want to do and do it consistently across all of your fabrics and everything that you're doing for a particular project. So I hope that was helpful, and we'll look forward to talking later. Take care. Bye.